Okay, I'm gonna start letting everybody in. So here we go. And admit all. So welcome everybody. Welcome. I'm gonna keep letting folks in. And we are going to get started quite quickly this evening because we have such a large group of folks. So I'm going to keep trying to admit folks, but I'm going to go ahead with my spiel, and then we're going to admit the rest of the folks. So good evening. Welcome to the UNC Center for the Business of Health Fireside Chat, AI and Healthcare. This fireside chat is part of our CBOH Career Networks program, and I'll put the link in the chat in just one moment. And there we go. That should be out to you all. I'm Suzanne Killian, and I have my CBOH colleague, Erin Leach, behind the scenes. We're so glad to see such a big audience tonight. We are pleased to be joined by our Keenan Flagler Business School alumni and CBOH partners, Adam Tomasiello and Mike Rowan, who will be discussing their current roles and work with AI in healthcare, a brief overview of what AI is and is not, a few cases in the real world, and the skill sets knowledge you can gain to be able to make some good AI implementation decisions, and an overview of future AI trends in their specific career areas and in healthcare in general. We will then open the floor for audience questions. Feel free to raise your digital hand at any time to ask a question in the meantime. Just a note, AI is a complicated topic, and there are many differing ideas and perspectives. So we hope that this will be an evening of sharing and learning for all. We'll kick off the session by having Adam and Mike introduce themselves. So I am going to go ahead and let them take it away. Adam and Mike, go ahead.
Awesome. Thanks, Suzanne. Thrilled to be here tonight and glad everyone's able to join. I just saw some videos. Looks like we got some folks on treadmills. We got some folks at a game. I love the multitasking. Adam Tomasello. I was really fortunate to graduate from UNC Keenan Flagler in the full-time MBA program in the class of 2020. While I was a student there, my concentrations were in data analytics and technology as well as in healthcare. My time at Keenan Flagler was absolutely transformative for me. It really helped me to crystallize and better understand the possibilities for someone with my interests, which really intersected business, strategy, and data science, and open up these really impactful careers in healthcare. Since I graduated from UNC in 2020, I was fortunate to join the leadership development program at LabCorp. I spent about a year and a half in our corporate strategy group. And fortunately, during my time in strategy, LabCorp actually started its own AI team. And so after about 6 months of noodling and pestering and talking to our executive director of AI, he offered me a chance to support their team part-time. And 10% of my time turned into 20%, turned into 50%, turned into me actually joining LabCorp's AI team full-time as our company's first ever director of AI products. So more than happy to go more into detail on that, but you know, it's great to actually work with a team of super talented data scientists solving healthcare and business challenges every single day. I'll turn it over to Mike.
Great. Thanks, Adam, and thanks, Suzanne. Hey, everybody. I'm Mike Rowan, founder and principal consultant at Covalence Health. We are a small boutique consulting firm based out of Washington, D.C., and we work exclusively in healthcare. We work across the industry in terms of the types of clients. We work with the payers, with the providers, life sciences, even work with investors. And we work primarily on transformation and growth strategy type projects. And by background, I'm a tech guy by training. I started out in technology and then through my career sort of transitioned into product development. And that's where I really started to engage with artificial intelligence and even some of the earlier models where it was just a matter of reactive machines that are simple algorithms. And through my career, I've been very fortunate to work in various segments and sectors of healthcare and kind of see the evolution of AI within the industry, but also take a look at some of the use cases and what works, what doesn't, what are some of the key challenges from ideation all the way through implementation. So I am more than happy to discuss any part of my experiences, and I hope that you will find the discussion very, very helpful in regards to getting a realistic picture of what truly is happening with artificial intelligence within the healthcare industry. Just another quick note, I am also, I think it was mentioned, a Keenan Flagler alum. I did the executive MBA program, graduated in 2012. And boy, I really wish that Suzanne and her team were existed back then, because that's one of the things that I thought Keenan Flagler was kind of short on, was really the concentration or focus on the healthcare industry. $4.5 trillion industry, one of the biggest in the world. We're literally the fifth largest economy in the world, just the healthcare industry itself. And there's a lot of opportunity there for Keenan Flagler and other graduates. So once again, thank you for having me, and looking forward to the discussion.
Awesome. So you all will start off with explaining to this wonderful crowd, what is AI? Give us a brief overview.
Mike, I jumped first. Why don't you go ahead on this one?
Yeah, I can kind of give you a little bit of history of AI. It's been around actually since 1950. So the concept of artificial intelligence, it's basically it's machines that are effectively leveraging some type of input and then processing an output based on the inputs that they've been given. And as I mentioned before, there's been quite a bit of evolution, especially more recently. But largely, when I think about AI, I can break it down into four broad categories. There's reactive machines. This is kind of, again, the simplest form of AI, right? It's an algorithm. It takes some type of input and then offers a recommendation based on the input it's been given. And the models are typically built on large data sets. And so it's highly dependent on the data that's available to it to make those decisions and make those recommendations. The second type is called limited memory machines. And these are built to be more reactive, if you will. And they have sort of this continuous learning capability and can predict behaviors based on a much broader set of inputs, right? And these are the things that we're starting to see evolve these days. Think of self-driving cars. That's probably a great example of that. A couple of others that are sort of more theoretical. There's theory of mind and also self-aware AI. And these are, again, we don't really have any real life applications of these, but these are basically models that can be trained on emotions. So think about as taking on the persona of a human being and being able to sort of evolve beyond what the inputs are, right? I always think about the movie The Terminator and Skynet, right? It's a self-aware machine that's able to evolve beyond what it's been actually fed. And then, I want to just talk about some of the terms that you commonly hear, or some of branches of AI, if you will, that we hear. And those are the popular ones are machine learning, natural language processing, and generative AI, which is the latest. Machine learning is exactly the way it sounds. It's basically machines that are autonomous. They have autonomous models that don't need explicit instructions to be able to compute a response to a request. Natural language processing, that's also pretty intuitive. It's basically machines or models that are designated or designed to basically take human speech as an input and then convert that into a set of instructions or into an algorithm. And then finally, we have generative AI, right? And this is like ChatGPT, for example, which is the big one. And the key difference in generative AI is it's just leveraging existing technologies, but the outputs are new content. And so that is what is sort of the breakthrough with generative AI technology, that it's not so much as an algorithm that's able to produce an output based on the data it's been provided, but it's actually able to generate new content based on the information or the prompts that you provided. We'll talk about some of the use cases in terms of how these are used in healthcare and then more broadly, but let me pause there, and Adam, feel free to add to what I just.
No, I think that was a great overview, Mike, and I think you sort of hit the nail on the head. I spend pretty much all of my day trying to explain to people that artificial intelligence is not Skynet and not here to take over the world. Very simply put, my role at LabCorp, I'm trying to translate, between data scientists and kind of business folks, some of whom have a really wide varying degree of understanding of what AI and ML and all these technologies might be. The simplest definition I can give you is it's a model that consumes data and you're trying to predict something, right? And that word predict is critical because even though AI technologies can be broad, you might have computer vision, like the thing that says, you know, click all of the fire hydrants in these photos. Or if you're building out an NLP model and you're trying to pull text off of a PDF, or if you're trying to build an advanced forecast to predict what's going to happen next month with my sales, right? All of these things kind of fit in that bucket of AI. What's the thing they all have in common? You're feeding data into the model and you're trying to predict something on the other side. And as I think we get into that, there's healthcare specific use cases, would really lean on you all to remember that word prediction, right? Because I think things will become actually a bit clearer about, where we've seen success and where we haven't when you really lean in on that.
Terrific. Thank you for that explanation. I think that clears a lot up for folks or might add some more questions that they might have. So I think that a lot of the questions that I hear from not just students, but folks, out in the world who may be getting introduced to AI are, what are the real world cases? And we hear fantastical things like, how AI is going to change the world, or there's like deep fakes and things such as that. But what are the real cases that you all see that people are really taking AI to help, them in their careers, them in their job roles, to make things easier, better, and are the future?
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in, Suzanne, because I think there's probably some healthcare specific answers, but then also just some broader industry answers. And I'll say this without jumping too far ahead. There are a lot of AI articles, particularly now, particularly in this generative AI space, that use verbs like could or will or may do this in the future or have the potential to. And there's not nearly as many articles of here's where we've actually seen some realized value from artificial intelligence models. When I'm sort of looking for new potential AI use cases, in my own role, say here at LabCorp, a couple of things I look for. One, are there humans trying to make a decision? Are there humans trying to generate something? A human sort of needs to be necessary in this often. There are some pretty amazing AI models, out there that don't necessarily have humans in the loop, as we say, but those are typically the exception, not the norm. So like, where is a human trying to make a decision? Another question I ask myself, where do I wish I had a crystal ball? That's another great way to think about going about it. And maybe a third thing is, how can I eliminate some part of my job that is not a huge value add to the organization I'm at? And where could I eliminate and then be sort of leveraging the top of my degree, right? So thinking about those things, where I've seen, particularly in the healthcare space, but also in other industries, where I've seen AI, making the biggest difference is often not on the super sexy, potential sort of things, but where you see a lot of realized values and things like, think about generative AI models, right? Writing emails, pulling together presentations, right? You still need a human in those cases to pull together, savvy content and important details, but sort of the baseline, highly repeated tasks, you can use AI there for. I mean, things like forecasts, being able to incorporate new data sources and produce better forecasts, optimization. Think about for the MBA students, right? Like solver on steroids, right? Think about like, how do we deploy our resources? How do we forecast our, our staffing needs based on, sort of turnover and demand and all these sort of things. Fraud detection, right? How can I take a guess at whether or not this is a real transaction or not, right? There's so much just low hanging fruit right in front of us. But I think about like those highly repeated tasks that typically would involve a human trying to make a prediction. or use a crystal ball. Those are often kind of the things I think of that are great use cases for AI. But Mike would welcome your perspective.
Yeah, Adam, I love that you sort of went broad, because I'm going to go deep and get a little bit specific in terms of what are some of the things that we are seeing. As I mentioned before, being a consultant gives me the luxury of seeing the applications across the various segments of healthcare. And Adam makes a great point. You know, we've thrown some numbers around. You know, I would argue that 5% of what you hear in the use cases of AI are actually practical enough to be implemented in healthcare today, right? There's a lot of challenges that, you know, we can get into what some of those challenges are that sort of prohibit AI kind of taking over healthcare. But if I think about use cases, you know, I'm going to kind of break this down by the various segments. So, you know, since we're in the RTP, I'll talk about life sciences because you have a lot of life sciences organizations there. Many of the companies that we have worked with, they use AI to basically improve the models that they have. And those models typically have to do with drug discovery, market access, healthcare economics, and also clinical trials. Some of the other components that are kind of feeding into that is this whole idea of health equity, for example, and the inequities that have existed that have prevented better healthcare outcomes. And so what you're starting to see is not just better models, but also better data inputs. So we're starting to see the addition of real world data in some of those models. And now they're able to better predict in all of those cases, drug discovery, market access, the economics and outcomes reporting in clinical trials, they're able to give you a more accurate and more efficient outputs in terms of where do you want to do that clinical trial for the next cancer drug? Who are the types of individuals you want to include to ensure that you are accounting for some of those inequities? So those are some of the use cases that we're seeing on the pharma side. And to Adam's point, this is really more around just perfecting something that's already out there and creating some more automation. So you don't have a team of 7 data scientists and 20 analysts doing this. You basically have 4 data scientists, a couple of analysts, and then a really robust AI model that's doing it. Moving on to the healthcare payers, these are the healthcare insurance. If you think about fundamentally what healthcare insurers actually do is they're actuaries at the end of the day, right? They're trying to basically assess risk, quantify that risk, and then determine how much do you need to collect in premium in order to ensure that you're covered and you're able to cover the cost of that risk occurring and make a little bit of profit on top of that. And so you're seeing a lot of activities around models that are doing risk stratification for a broad population. And that's better understanding the level of wellness of your population and also understanding not just details about who are my chronically or who are my diabetic patients, but really understanding some of the drivers around why are these individuals where they are and the spectrum of wellness to being really, really sick. And that is very, very important in terms of being able to more accurately assess and quantify that risk. Another piece is revenue cycle management. And if you've been watching healthcare news, you probably heard about a company called Change Healthcare, had a huge data breach. But revenue cycle management is largely what they do. And this is something that's pretty straightforward. Again, it's a very relatively low skill, if you will, administrative activity. But there's actually a lot of opportunity to make it more efficient and actually optimize the revenue, both from a healthcare provider standpoint and also be able to manage unnecessary utilization, fraud, waste, and abuse from healthcare payer standpoint. So you're starting to see a lot of emergence of AI there as well. Switching over to healthcare providers, we're seeing a lot of predictive models with clinical pathways. Now, a lot of these kind of fall into that category of what we talked about, or just conceptually, they're great. Practical implementation of these are rather difficult, but there are opportunities that we can implement these relatively easy. And where we have seen this is when patients are diagnosed with a specific condition or they're discharged from the hospital and they need some post-acute care for rehabilitation. there are really, really neat models out there that can basically take in a lot of factors. Once again, clinical history, as well as what happened in the hospital with the patient, as well as including some of that real world data to factoring some of the socioeconomic factors and predict the best path of care for that patient to achieve their optimal outcomes. So you're starting to see a lot of that. But really, the thing that we're seeing most on the provider side is really the administrative staff. And the administrative staff takes on a lot of stuff, and not all of them are administrative. There's a lot of nurses effectively that are, lack a better term, doing a lot of administrative staff because we just are not sophisticated enough with technologies to automate some of these activities. Believe it or not, nearly 50% of the communications in healthcare are done through fax machines still. And so if you think about how much time it takes to spend on a fax machine, and how taxing that is for a clinician or administrative individual's time, there's a lot of opportunity to automate a lot of that and leverage AI to effectively take care of some of those very, very mundane tasks. And what that effectively does, it allows those individuals to work at the top of their license and be able to focus on patient care, which is effectively what they're there for. Some of the other things that we're starting to see is really around sort of the outskirts of the healthcare industry, or some of the intermediaries, if you will, like consulting, healthcare services. We're starting to see better tools for identification, profiling, and targeting populations, right? So if you think about it from a marketing standpoint, if you have solutions out there that are trying to engage diabetics into a wellness program, there's a lot of really neat AI tools out there that give you a better targeting capability, but also what is the best way to communicate to these individuals? Do they respond to email? Do they prefer phone calls? Do they want to have someone visiting them? Those are the types of things that we have not really had before and been able to leverage in marketing a lot of the capabilities and services in healthcare. And then a lot of what we work on as consultants are, as I mentioned, we do a lot of transformation and growth strategy. And both payers, providers, we have a lot of data out there. And a lot of this data typically gets kind of dumped into a model, and it gives you some type of projection of what the growth potential could be. Largely in the past, these have been regression models. It's just a linear regression that someone is using, and they're very, very simple. You're starting to see those evolve into more AI, which once again, they're taking factors that are beyond what happened in the past and looking at the broader environment to make predictions in terms of what is the opportunity for growth in a specific segment of healthcare, whether it's a company that's looking to expand their nursing home business into a new market, or if it's a hospital that's trying to emphasize on a new line of business or focus on a different line of business. And those are some of the applications that we're starting to really see emerge in healthcare. I know I've said a mouthful there, so let me pause and turn it back over to Suzanne.
Terrific. That's exactly what we wanted, mouthfuls of these examples. So that was terrific from both you and Adam. So thank you so much. So again, we heard kind of, as you all mentioned, kind of the day-to-day, the non-sexy types of AI. But when we look for the future, we read so many articles in the healthcare realm about future trends in AI. What are you all seeing? What are kind of like the moonshots that you see might actually, come to fruition in healthcare and AI?
Go ahead, Adam.
Yeah, I think Suzanne, I think I'll maybe take a step back with the response to that, which is, I think Mike actually hit on some of the things where we're trying to end with AI, right? You're sort of like, how can we have AI more embedded in sort of clinical decision making and personalized medicine, and putting together all these crazy combinations of chemical molecules to create new drugs for patients, and how could we use AI to eliminate animals from clinical trials? Like all these sort of things are all on the docket of future possibilities. this is like, I'm kind of going to date myself by a few years, right? But like, what was the buzzword before AI? It was big data, right? Like 2015, the word was big data. And I think this is important, at least from my lens of like, on the one hand, we definitely, there's a lot of interest, there's a lot of hype, there's a lot of, movement in that direction with AI. But on the other hand, the most classic, statistical saying, right, is garbage in, garbage out, right? And I think when I think about a lot of those use cases, and when you see a lot of this in like academic settings of like, hey, we used AI to predict Alzheimer's 3 years earlier than we could have by looking at EMRs and our own EMRs, or hey, we used AI to, you know, review all of these medical, histology images or what have you. I think the thing that's going to be a limiting factor, and fortunately, where I think people are starting to realize this, is just data availability, right? We all know that if you want to build a great AI model, you need like especially in the healthcare setting, you need a very diverse data set so that what you produce is not biased and it actually makes a big difference for patients. And it's sort of applicable, regardless. It's sort of agnostic to the health system, it's agnostic to geography, et cetera. So what's like the limiting factor to building those AI models? In my opinion, it's not the AI technology. We have technology that could do some of these use cases, but the big limiting factor at the moment is the data, right? You can't build, what I see in a lot of academic research papers in these fields is, hey, we built this really cool predictive health model and it works amazing for our, based on, UNC health patients. But guess what? It doesn't work at all down the road at Wake Forest, right? And what's that reflective of? It's reflective of the care that providers provide at UNC versus the care that's provided at Wake Forest. It's a little nerve-wracking, right? But it's, it's so human-based. And okay, so we've got all these folks in the US holding on to pockets of data. And guess what? The UK has their own healthcare system where all the data is controlled by the government, and they're not going to just hand that over. And every country in the EU and Asia Pacific, and everyone's kind of got their own system. So I think we're starting to realize as we try and build a lot of these models and make these predictive models standard of care, not meant to replace doctors, but really meant to augment the way that we're doing work and developing new therapies and bring new drugs to market, et cetera, right? What's going to be the big limitation is data. And I think folks are starting to realize that we're working towards having better data quality and larger data sets, data lakes. A lot of folks I'm sure have heard of like the TEFCA, all these new data standards. But at least with our system today, that's going to be a big limiting factor. It's not the technology, it's the data that's limiting us from getting to some of these new heights.
Those are great points, Adam. As I think about some of the things that are kind of emerging, we touched on imaging, right? And Adam talked about leveraging AI to basically read some of those, whether it's diagnostic results that you get at a lab or you get a MRI scan or an X-ray scan, and having AI be able to read and interpret that image. And right now, you have radiologists that are doing that, and the turnaround on that can be relatively long because they're backed up and they have pretty significant size queues that they have to go through all of these images, make the interpretation, and then send that back to the referring doc. Those are some of the things that we're starting to see some really, really neat innovations around. But once again, Adam talked about the data component as being sort of an inhibitor, if you will. But some of the other things that we're starting to realize as we come up with these models and come up with these cool concepts is that innovation in healthcare is very, very, very difficult. Unfortunately, it's one area where we need the most innovation. It's very difficult. And for me, a lot of it comes down to we have a lot of fragmentation in the industry. And in that fragmentation, we have misaligned incentives. And so not everyone is sort of marching to the beat of the same drum in terms of what they want out of the industry. And so those misaligned incentives force folks to kind of focus on different areas than versus everyone kind of focusing on the same goal. A few other things, we often talk about bias in AI models. And earlier on, Adam and I had a really good conversation that the models themselves are not biased, right? It's the humans that are biased. And because humans have provided all those historical inputs, that is going to tilt the model in one direction or another, right? And we talked about this in the context of health inequities. Those are things that are relatively easy to fix. I think where you start to see a little bit of agitation from the clinical side is you get pushback from the clinical community that says, well, we really don't trust machines or are smart enough to understand patients because every patient is different. To some extent, that's true, but that's largely a cultural thing. But, you know, whatever the root cause may be, it's one of those things that's going to prohibit innovation and expansion of AI. Another key thing that I believe is something that we need to kind of get in front of sooner versus the later, and we need action from the policy folks here in DC to kind of step in, is the liability, right? There are a lot of, we talk about delivering patient care and having machines make some of those decisions. Well, who's going to be liable for those decisions if they're the wrong ones? And those are some of the things that we really need to kind of put our arms around and have some guidelines and guidance in place. We're already starting to see the FDA do this. The FDA has been regulating certain types of AI, especially those that are in medical devices and implantables these days. Those are currently regulated by the FDA. But there's a huge component of these clinical decision support systems that, from a tech standpoint, we feel confident that can make the same decisions that a clinician can. But if there's no liability, I don't see how they're actually going to go into practice if we haven't figured out the liability. The other thing is the point solutions. I think a lot of the tech startups that we run into as consultants and we're advising is there's so many point solutions out there. Everyone thinks they have this great technology that can do these great things. And a lot of them, you know, when you think of them in a silo, they're true, but that's not how the world operates. So we often make the recommendation that if you're going to create a solution, you have to figure out how practical it is and how easy can you implement that in the broader ecosystem of what that clinician is currently working in. Because your solution is only one piece of what they have to do. It's not going to be everything. So I think there are a lot of hurdles out there in terms of how quickly or how can we accelerate the infusion or the innovation of AI into healthcare. But there are some things that we just have to kind of figure out and answer first. And I think once we do that, we're going to start to see more innovation, and we're going to start to see some of those sexy things kind of come into play in healthcare.
I just want to add, like, first of all, Mike, I think you used a couple savvier words than are part of my regular diction, which I appreciate. One of which is the fragmentation, which is a huge limiting factor. But you know, the second thing you said that I just could not agree with more, Mike, is the alignment of incentives and the misalignment that we see today. I know that we all want, you know, this idea of, you know, we joke about it at LabCorp because we do a lot of blood draws. We joke about like the robotomists and as we call them, robot phlebotomists. Can you imagine putting your arm under a robot phlebotomist? Like, who's going to volunteer to be the first one to do that? It's not me. I'll tell you that. But there's so much talk about that. But I want you to think about, I'm going to give you a perspective. If the organization in healthcare that you go and work for has its incentives aligned, even the not sexy, boring AI initiatives that you do are going to make a colossal difference. Think about that hospital that has nurses and providers and administrative staff who are getting burnt out day to day doing administrative things that don't allow them to actually provide patient care. They're tired, they're angry, they're frustrated, they're leaving the industry. If you do something that's doing scribing for them or is taking some of that administrative burden off, and that creates a better work environment for your employees, you have now just provided better patient care to your patients, right? Those little things go such a long way if your organization's incentives are all aligned towards the patient, right? And just as Mike said, if we start getting these wins now, right? AI it's been around for a while, but the in-your-face AI, it's so new. That's going to increase adoption exponentially in the future. But get like those things might not seem cool and flashy. You're not going to read a lot about them in the news, but they make such a big difference.
Absolutely. Just terrific responses there. And this is a great time because I know, just like myself, I have a million questions. I'm sure that our audience does as well. So we are going to turn it over to our audience. Again, you have the option of just raising your digital hand. I hope I didn't raise my hand, because I think if you raise your hand, sometimes it pops up, sometimes it doesn't. But please, any questions that you have, we have two wonderful folks here and a whole audience full of folks as well to bring along this discussion. So please, anybody want to be the first one? Brave question asker out there.
When it comes to licensing, like models or algorithms for healthcare, do you think it's more challenging than just licensing hard code? And how would you go about that?
I can take that one. I don't think there is a lot of difference in terms of licensing the model versus, a piece of application, right? Because if you think about, and this is probably true across all of industries, but there are a lot of services out there that do custom application development. And it kind of follows the same process and same evolution with AI and building those AIs. There are certain organizations that, they have what we will call black box analytics, right? They consider it proprietary. IBM's one of them. Their Watson model is proprietary. They don't want to pop the hood up and show everyone how it works. But largely, especially in healthcare, black box analytics are four-letter words. It's not something, especially the clinical community, wants to hear. Everyone wants to kind of see what's happening. And so it's more conducive to the industry to be a little bit more open with that. And that makes sort of it aligns the licensing component and the distribution and resell of those licenses very similar to what you do with a platform or an application. Does that answer?
Much.
Great, thank you, William. And I hope I'm not seeing hands, but again, just like William did, if you want to unmute and just ask your questions, you kind of be pulled up to the front of the queue. Oh, and Brianna.
Hello, good evening. Can y'all hear me? Sorry. Okay, good. So I have a question. And this is, I'm probably like a double-edged sword, but I understand the integration of AI and how it can completely help with aspects of taking away time from the clinical aspect, getting kind of mitigating some of those administrative portions to it. But do you feel like there is the component for this technology to potentially be abused or misused with retrospect to like replacement of employment or affecting people's job securities?
Yeah, I'll maybe jump in on that one. I think I'm a big fan. There's a lot of like AI isms that go viral, and I'm a big fan of them. I have like a laundry list at this point. One of my favorite AI isms is that AI is not going to replace you, but somebody using AI is going to replace you. And I think, that saying hints on maybe two things. One, there's very few, I'm not saying there's none, but there's very few AI models out there that can operate without a human in the loop. And there's really two places that the humans sort of come into the loop. One of those places is the user themselves, right? Because those users should be using AI to augment the way that they work or work differently or work smarter, not using AI to replace the way that they're doing work, right? I think you've all probably seen plenty of examples, in the academic setting of someone who used ChatGPT to write an essay and it came out complete garbage because the thing hallucinated, right? So we have techniques, that we can build these generative AI models and large language models that hallucinate less than the large, internet, off the shelf kind of ones. But none of these are perfect. So yes, I do think you run the risk if you have somebody who's using it to replace the way they're working, that's going to be a problem. I don't think we're going to get to that point. I think you still have to have a human who's being smart about the way they use it. on the other end of that human in the loop, you also need to have somebody who's constantly retraining these models. And I say that there's very few models that operate completely without a human, because even some of the most advanced AI systems in the world, I think about like the recommendation engines that we all see on Amazon, right? I think about the YouTubes and Facebooks and TikTok recommendation engines that are suggesting what comes next to you. Even those are constantly being, retuned and maintained by humans. So I think that, yes, on the one hand, if you have someone who's using an AI model to do their job, they might be able to work 2 times as fast or 3 times as fast or 4 times as fast as someone who's not. And that's going to create these opportunities for labor arbitrage. But we're very unlikely, in my opinion, to get to the point where humans are completely cut out of the loop, either on the front end or the back end. And B, we are constantly going to have to hit up on that journey of, you can't just let the AI model go and do its thing. You can't just let ChatGPT write your essay and think that's going to be good, because we're not quite there yet. And Mike made that point. This question of liability is going to keep coming up from the rules at your company standpoint all the way to sort of legal and sort of greater compliance. So I think, yes, I definitely think there's going to be labor arbitrage opportunities for AI. We're going to see more of those. But no, I don't think we're going to get to the point where the AI models that we see today are going to ever operate without humans. And I think that we need to continually educate folks on that these are meant to supplement or augment the way that you're working, not replace the way that you're working.
Thank you.
The only thing that I would add is, I think you make a great point, Brianna, about the double-edged sword, right? Because any technology that we look at historically, the intent has been for it to be used for good, but unfortunately, there are just bad people in the world, right? And they will find alternative uses or unintended uses that have different consequences. I mean, you take a look at misinformation that's been spread through the internet. And so I think it's difficult to say whether it's not going to be used for evil. I think Adam makes a great point that if we design it the right way and have all of those controls in place, then we can prevent a lot of those harmful use cases from occurring. But I think it's hard to predict.
Thank you. Understood completely.
Great. And next question, Jack.
Hey everybody, thanks a lot. Learning a lot here. I appreciate your time this evening. My question is kind of similar in the regard, I don't really know if this is an AI specific problem, but anytime you're using large data sets, there's obviously privacy concerns, and people may be opting in for data where they don't know how that data is going to be used into the future. I'm thinking particularly as data is shared across different industries within healthcare. If you give your insurer consent to use your data, and that data ends up in the hands of like drug research and something that you didn't want it to be used in, how do you navigate some of the complexities with that?
Mike, do you want to hop on first? Got some feedback there.
Yeah, happy to. I mean, that is an ongoing concern, and you make the way you preface the question, it's not just an AI thing, right? Right now, that's happening. If you sign up for health insurance, how often do you read the fine print that says, here's how we're going to use or not going to use your data, right? And because we don't do that, they kind of sneak that in on us, and they take our data and they have multiple use cases. I brought up Change Healthcare with parent companies United Health Group, or a branch of United Health Group, which is Optum. Optum makes a lot of money off the data that they get off of United Healthcare's members, as well as from Change Healthcare. So if you think about all of the patient claims that go through a clearinghouse like Change Healthcare, literally millions of it on a daily basis, that's data that Optum has access to, and they absolutely monetize it, and they monetize the hell out of it, excuse my language. But I think one of the things that we have to really, really be focused on here is it's a shared responsibility. I think there's a lot that policy can do in that regard, right? We have HIPAA, we have the PHI rules, We have the privacy rules in place, but is that enough, right? To what extent are we educating folks? And I think that's where it's an intersection of policy and sort of enforcing some of these organizations to educate folks on the use of data before they get them to sign something. But also, the third party in that, which really is the first party, is the members themselves, the individuals themselves. And, just making sure that you understand what you're signing before you do it. And if you have concerns about your data sharing, make sure that you understand what the fine print says, and ensure that it's not being used for something that you don't want it to, or it's not being used in a use case that is not intended for the purpose of business, because data still is an asset. I mean, Adam mentioned earlier that one of the biggest challenges we have is that we don't have enough data to build some of these models and have them function properly. So it's an asset that a lot of companies are willing to pay a lot of money to acquire in order to build some of those really sophisticated models. So understanding that there's a market out there for this, that any individual or organization that's going to have your data or have access to it could potentially have ulterior motives, and they could have plans to monetize that data. So I think it's a very, very complicated situation, and it requires a very complex solution. It has to be policy, it has to be on the organizations, and it has to be on the individual.
Yeah, I would second that, Mike and Jack. It's a super deep and complicated question at the moment. Because you see, I'll tell you, I definitely don't envy the chief information security officers of any company right now, right? Because, AI, just as Mike said, is being used by the good guys, and it's also being used by the not good guys at the moment, right? And they have constant new challenges of fighting against AI cyber attacks and AI phishing and all these sort of things, right? You can use all this technology for not so great things too. I'd say, to be completely frank with you, Jack, I bet that any single person in this audience, we could go find your data right now on a health data exchange. If you aren't familiar with some of these health data exchanges, I'd encourage you to just kind of Google that, search it. Most of that's going to be de-identified, right? Because payers are putting their data into these de-identified tokens, and all different kinds of health systems are putting their data into these de-identified tokens, and you can go and buy those, and you're trusting these third parties to sort of have the security necessary to contain those. But again, if you don't, I don't envy the chief information security officers. I also don't envy the chief privacy and compliance officers, because navigating the what's acceptable, what's not, what's an appropriate use case for my data to be used, what's not. I mean, there's individuals at these companies deciding whether or not selling your data is appropriate or not on these exchanges. I think that it's a very much an evolving space. It's a very complex space. I'll maybe give you all just one tangible thing that you can do wherever you join. If you're at a large healthcare firm in particular, one thing that we stood up at LabCorp is an AI ethics board, right? And guess who's on that AI ethics board? Yes, it's members of the AI team, but it's our chief information security officer and their leaders. It's our chief compliance officer. It's our chief regulatory officer. It's our chief scientific officer, right? It's our chief diversity officer. It's those individuals who are getting their perspectives and weighing in on how that data is being leveraged. So I'd encourage you, if your company doesn't have something like that, or you're not thinking about it, you can be a real change maker by being proactive and bringing these ideas forward now, because the technology is moving faster than the regulatory bodies that can. So.
Great. Wow. Super complete answer there. And then it makes one think too, you can go totally analog and not have the small print, as Mike said, which is so interesting. Maybe a pledge for clarity for patients and users. All right, we've got another question. Uthra.
Thank you, Suzanne. And thank you, Mike and Adam, for being here today. One other player that we haven't talked about today is the FDA. So I wanted to know what your opinion is on the FDA's outlook about AI, because we are taking leaps and bounds forward, but they could come up with regulations. In the US, the data is a highly regulated space, as Mike already mentioned, with HIPAA and patient data protection programs. So do you think there's a possibility that the FDA would set up an ethics board about how AI should be used, and that can actually set us back, our companies anticipating something like this? What are your opinions on the FDA's outlook on AI?
Yeah, great question. I'll maybe just answer briefly from the LabCorp perspective and what we're seeing. I mentioned our AI ethics board is made up of our regulatory team. There is, we sort of have been following along. There's AI ethics guides and code lines being guidelines and codes being developed here in the U.S. that the FDA is sort of part of those conversations. Those similar guidelines are being developed in the UK, and the EU has its own version. So we're constantly trying to stay abreast of all the development in there. But I would encourage you to search. There's a little bit going on in the US in that space. We've been interacting with the FDA just in terms of some of our own AI modeling. And one of the things that we're finding is it's where the FDA is sort of putting their foot in versus taking their foot out. It's really use case dependent. And it often comes down to some of the things that Mike and I have already chatted about, right? At least from sort of our perspective, if you're doing sort of these broad-based, de-identified, population health type use cases, they tend to be a little bit more supportive versus once you kind of cross that threshold to individual patient care, there's a lot more concern and a lot more hurdles. But at the end of the day, from our perspective, where I see the vast majority of regulation heading is more on the data, which is where I think it should be going, right? It's really scrutinizing the data, because the AI models are sort of becoming not a commodity, but there's a lot more AI education out there, and these models and modeling techniques, there's a lot more trust in those if you have the right data set. So I'd say it's very much an evolving space. We've had some interactions with those groups. It really is use case dependent at the moment from what we've seen. But Mike, I'm sure you're in DC. Why don't you mention more there?
Well, I think I brought this up when I talked about liability, right? So the FDA right now, they do actually regulate a lot of, what I will call a lot of devices, and then to an extent, some of the tech tools out there that use AI, but they're very, very specific use cases. So if you think about the FDA and the authority they have, right, it's basically to ensure public safety, from food, drugs, and then any type of medical, what I'll call clinical care, not necessarily just medical, right? And if you look at sort of the guardrails that they have in place, they have the authority to make decisions on anything that's going to impact clinical care. And so if you think about implantable devices, right, what do? You implant them into a patient, and, they use radio waves and signals to basically spit out information about what's going on with that patient, right? Think about heart monitors, for example, right? And these are some of the things that, because they're sort of entrenched into care delivery, and they provide alerts to a clinical team, the FDA has oversight over that. What the FDA doesn't have oversight, and they certainly can, right? Because the HHS, who runs FDA, they can certainly empower them with this oversight, is any type of predictive model that we see out there that doesn't necessarily perform or predict clinical care, right? I mentioned one of the models that I have seen in the past where it effectively spits out a recommendation and says, hey, the patient should go and have this trajectory of care, or this plan of care once they're discharged from the hospital, right? And what it will recommend is the patient should go to skilled nursing for 2 weeks, and then they should go to home health and get a certain number of days of therapy. What it doesn't predict is what type of therapies should they get once they're in the skilled nursing facility. And there's a differentiator, right? And there's effectively where they kind of stay away from that jurisdiction of the FDA with that model, because they're not recommending clinical care. They're just recommending a care setting for that patient and a care path for that patient. So that's where you kind of have a couple of issues, right? And just to kind of summarize what I'm trying to articulate here is, there are areas where the FDA has jurisdiction, and they already are doing, to an extent, a lot of regulation and oversight there. But there are areas where they don't have that right now. And that is where the gap is. And so when I was talking about liability, I'm largely talking about areas where we don't have an oversight. And so we don't have any guidelines in terms of who's going to be responsible, accountable, or liable if things go sideways with one of these models. I hope that was helpful.
That was a great response.
Yes, it was. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Great question. Kevin.
Thanks, Suzanne. Hey, Mike, Adam, good discussion. Appreciate that. Hey, just one comment based on Uthra's question. The FDA does have a website for the Digital Health Center of Excellence. It's a great resource to get some insight into what the FDA is thinking, but not only AI, but digital health in general. So I'd encourage everybody to go out there and just get a peek at what they're thinking and talking about inside the FDA. Hey, the question I have for you guys is, you touched on bias, both in the data and, quite frankly, sometimes in the algorithms, because they're human built as well. What techniques have you guys seen effective in mitigating the risk of that bias in either clinical or in a life science setting when they're trying to identify and discover new drugs?
How do you want to take this one?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely, Kevin. Well, I would stand by the original comment I made, which Mike said, which I'm a firm believer that there is no such thing as a biased AI model. There's if it's true AI, it's just math layered on data. Now, as you said, that can be that model was constructed by a human, and that human might have missed something. And two, that data might have some bias to it. So I guess what I would say is this, number one, how do you avoid bias in data? It's scale, large data sets, as much objective data as possible, right? The most successful AI models, in my opinion, that we see today are things like, the Netflix reinforcement learning model recommending things, and the, Amazon, I suggest that you bought this, you should also buy this. Why do those have no bias? Because there is no bias, right? You either did buy it or you didn't buy it, right? It's yes, no. And so, when you're thinking about that data set, scaling that data set up, making sure that it has as much objective data and not subjective data as possible, that's huge. I think the poster child of biased AI models is, hey, we built this AI model to review resumes and it only selected white male candidates. Well, yeah, the model did math based on the fact that your HR department only has selected white male candidates for the last 30 years, right? Those are subjective decisions made by humans. So I think that the first thing is the scale of the data, the breadth of the data, in building that, and you can start to avoid some bias. But the second thing is in the model development, and that's where I'll spend maybe just a second, because I think that's even most important. If you're observing at your organization or wherever you're going to work, this is going out to the students here, and you see that your AI team is sort of sitting in a basement, or you have data scientists sitting in a basement working on things, and you have no idea what those are, that's a recipe for disaster. The way at least our team works to avoid bias in models is sort of twofold. One, we always co-develop AI solutions and AI products with end users and with a diverse group of individuals. I mentioned in our company, we have an AI ethics board that's made up of our, folks who are working in data governance, folks who are working, our chief diversity officer, folks who are working in the compliance group. And anytime we're building someone, we're bringing those folks along for this entire journey to make sure that they're weighing in on the construction of the model, the way we're approaching those techniques, the data that's being used. And then on the back end, how are we reviewing and validating a model's results before that thing goes to be deployed or goes into production, right? You're constantly bringing a diverse group of stakeholders along the way. Don't let a data scientist just go run off and build something. When you think about any product, AI or not, bringing together your stakeholders, your clients, your end users, and a diverse group of individuals on a team together is mission critical. And, we have found we've been able to really build some powerful stuff, but the stuff that's really fitting a lot of those really crucial ethical standards. But Mike, I'd be curious if you have any thoughts on this too.
No, that was pretty comprehensive, but just to build on that, I think just to think about some practical examples in case of clinical trials, for example, right? And, to Adam's point, bias exists because we have made biased decisions in the past, right? And that's been recorded in the data. That data has been used to develop the model, and now the model has learned that bias, and therefore it's going to behave based on that bias. But one of the things that I have seen, and we work with a couple of companies that are pretty big size. One of them is down in the RTP that works on a lot of big data models, and they're incorporating real world data into these models. One of the things that they are doing that I think is really, really neat is sort of grading the results, right? And basically, and this is just something that every organization has to do. I think it's instrumental to work to building the right AI model, is going back and looking at the result and giving it some type of grade. And that grade is part of the learning process for the AI. And now you can go back and say, oh, that answer has a lot of bias in it. I'm going to give it a bad grade, where this one actually has a better, more equitable response. I'm going to give that a better grade. And those are some of the practices that you're seeing in real life in order to make sure that you're going to remove the bias, even when it's baked in. And again, I want to just emphasize the fact that bias is going to exist because of how we've been behaving over the past, well, as long as we can remember, unfortunately. So what is happening is right now is we're trying to basically say those behaviors were incorrect. I know you, machine, are predicting something based on past behaviors that were not correct or not the right decision. So let me just sort of give you some feedback to make sure that this doesn't happen again.
Great. Thanks, gentlemen.
Terrific. Great question. Great responses, but I hate to say it, it's actually 7:01, so we're just a tad bit over time. But I just want to thank both Mike and Adam so very much for taking this time. It's so very informative. And again, too, double-edged sword. Anybody who's nervous about AI, the fact that we just had a discussion tonight that brought up bias, equity, security, quality, and collaboration, if it's making people get together and talk about these things, I think that we're going to be okay. So, so again, thank you to this wonderful audience. Everybody have a great night, and you can actually tell some friends that this will be on our YouTube channel, so just check our website. But again, thanks. We'll see you next time.
And it's isn't it Giving Day for Keenan Flagler? Don't forget to participate.
Oh my goodness, Adam, you're so right. Give. Yes, definitely in CBOH, and also we have giving for our new undergraduate minor for the business of health. Again, thanks. You're awesome. Thanks. Have a great night, everybody.